My son saved $400 to help his dead friend's dad. My stepdaughter stole it, and my wife lied to the police to protect her. 2 days ago, my son Jay came to my job upset and crying. He told me my stepdaughter Kay came home with a ton of new purchases, and when he checked his room, the money he had been saving was gone. Kay doesn't have a job, but when she does have money, she spends it like it'll burn a hole in her pocket if it stays there. My boss let me go home early, and I went to ask Kay who took her shopping. Kay told me she used her own money. I told her to tell me the truth, and she told me to mind my own business. Jay has been working at a pizza shop and has been saving every dollar. He was saving to surprise the dad of his best friend who passed away last year. This weekend would have been his friend's first birthday without him. Jay and the other friends had pooled their money together to treat the dad to a weekend trip, pay for gas, food, everything. Most kids would be saving for their first car or cool clothes, but my son just wanted to be there for his friend's grieving father. Instead of arguing back and forth with Kay, I checked the camera we have to watch the dogs. It only caught her legs, but it was clearly Kay going into Jay's room. The rule in my house is we don't go into each other's rooms. It's a mutual respect of privacy. I told Kay she was caught on camera, and she needed to get everything together to return it. Kay started throwing every excuse she could think of. She claimed she had the money saved for months. She asked how I knew it was her. She said someone must have broken in. Then her mom came home and Kay burst into tears saying we were ganging up on her. I showed my wife the video and explained everything. Kay finally slipped up and said, "Why does he get to have all the money anyway?" I told my wife she needed to make Kay return everything, and she refused. She said it would be embarrassing to return it all, and that when Kay got a job she would repay Jay. I told her it would be more embarrassing when her daughter got arrested for stealing $400. We argued, and I told my wife that Kay broke a non-negotiable rule and also broke the law. She is 19 years old. She doesn't pay rent. She needs to leave. My wife looked at me and said, "If you kick her out, I'm going too." I asked if she was willing to replace the stolen money or force Kay to return everything or give me her half of rent early. All I got was no. They packed a few bags and left. I was not going to rip the shopping bags out of her hands because getting physical would not have been smart. I also don't have extra money to replace what was stolen so Jay could still make the trip. He went to bed without eating and was completely crushed. The next morning I called the police. The officer said he would call my wife and give her a choice. Either bring Kay to the station to talk or return the items and pay Jay back. It was a scare tactic because technically it's a civil matter. My wife straight up lied to the officer. She told him she gave that money to Kay herself. Since I don't have actual proof the cash belonged to Jay, and no proof other than Kay walking into his room, nothing could be done. I am livid. I literally watched my son's heart break at that police station. Through tears, he said, "How could they do this to me? What was this all for? I just wanted to see my friend's dad. I had to lecture him about not keeping large amounts of cash in his room, but he never thought his own family would steal from him. My wife and Kay have support. They're staying with family. This won't affect them at all." But last night, Jay's friend's dad called me. He said the other kids told him what happened and he wanted to talk. What he told me changed everything, and now I know exactly how this is going to end. The father's voice got quiet on the phone. He told me his son had a small life insurance policy through the school. One of those things they offer to all the students that most families don't even think about. But his son had filled out the paperwork himself during his senior year. He picked his dad as the person who would get the money. The father said he found a note with the policy papers after everything happened. His son wrote that he wanted his dad to take a trip somewhere and smile again. That he wanted his dad to remember the good times and not just be sad. I had to sit down when he told me that. This kid planned for his own death and still thought about making sure his dad would be okay. Jay's friend was only 17 when he passed. Most kids that age are thinking about prom or college or their next video game. But he was thinking about his father's grief and trying to help even after he was gone. The father's voice cracked when he said he couldn't believe how thoughtful his son was, even in the worst situation. He said reading that note broke his heart all over again, but also made him so proud. The father cleared his throat and said he'd been planning to use some of that money for exactly this kind of trip. He told me he was going to cover everything for Jay and the other boys this weekend. Gas, food, hotel, all of it. I started to tell him he didn't need to do that, but he cut me off. He said his son would be absolutely furious if Jay missed this trip because of what Kay did. He told me Jay was like another son to him, that all the boys were. They'd spent so much time at his house over the years that he considered them family. He said there was no way he was letting Kay's stealing ruin what the boys had planned to honor his son's memory. I tried to argue that it was too much, that he shouldn't have to spend his money because of my family's mess. But he wouldn't hear it. He told me the trip was happening no matter what, and Jay better be ready to go this weekend. I sat there holding the phone after we hung up. This man lost his child. He's living through every parent's worst nightmare. And instead of being angry at the world or drowning in his grief, he's thinking about my son. He's making sure Jay doesn't lose this chance to be part of something meaningful. I felt like I couldn't breathe for a second. The weight of his kindness hit me hard. Kay stole $400 and thought she got away with it. My wife lied to protect her and thought that was the end of it. But this father just showed them both what real character looks like, what it means to put someone else first even when you're hurting. I got up and headed straight to Jay's room. I needed to tell him right away. He needed to know that good people still exist and that his friend's dad wasn't going to let him down. I opened Jay's door without knocking. He was lying on his bed staring up at the ceiling. His eyes were still red and puffy from crying. The room felt heavy with sadness. He didn't even look at me when I came in. I sat down on the edge of his bed and told him I just got off the phone with his friend's dad. Jay didn't move. I said the trip was still happening, that the father was going to pay for everything so Jay and the other boys could still go this weekend. Jay finally turned his head and looked at me. He said I didn't need to lie to make him feel better, that it was okay if the trip was canceled. His voice was flat and defeated. I pulled out my phone and showed him the text the father had just sent me. It said he was honored to take the boys on this trip and that his son would want them all there. Jay stared at the screen for a long time. Then his face crumpled and he started crying again. But this time it was different. It wasn't the broken, desperate crying from earlier. This was relief mixed up with grief and gratitude all at once. Jay sat up and hugged me tight. He kept saying he couldn't believe it, that he couldn't believe his friend's dad would do this after everything that family had already been through. I told him some people are just good, that his friend's dad is one of those people who shows up when it matters. Jay pulled back and wiped his eyes. He said he felt guilty that the father had to spend his money because Kay stole from him. I reminded him that the father wanted to do this, that it wasn't charity or pity, it was family taking care of family. Jay nodded, but I could tell he was still processing everything. He asked if I thought his friend would be happy about the trip still happening. I told him I knew his friend would be happy, that his friend would probably be yelling at all of them if they didn't go. The next morning, I woke up to voices downstairs. I came down and found Derek and Lucas in the kitchen with Jay. All three of them were talking fast and loud. They kept interrupting each other with excitement. The father had called all of them last night with the same news. Lucas said his mom cried when she heard what the father was doing. Derek said his parents wanted to chip in money, but the father told them absolutely not, that this was his way of honoring his son and he didn't want anyone else paying. The boys were making plans about what to bring and what they wanted to do on the trip. Jay looked completely different from the night before. His whole face had changed. There was light in his eyes again. Hope. I made them all breakfast and listened to them plan. It felt good to hear Jay laughing with his friends, to see him excited about something after watching him so crushed yesterday. After the boys left for school, my phone rang. My wife's name showed up on the screen. I almost didn't answer, but I picked up on the fourth ring. Her voice sounded tired and strained when she said hello. She asked if we could talk. I could hear something in her tone that wasn't there before. Like staying at her sister's house wasn't going as well as she expected. There was noise in the background. Kids yelling and a TV on too loud. I asked what she wanted to talk about. She said she missed me, that this whole situation was tearing her apart and she didn't know what to do anymore. I felt myself getting angry again. She created this situation by choosing to protect Kay instead of doing what was right. But I kept my voice calm. I told her I was willing to talk only if she was ready to make Kay return the items or pay Jay back. There was a long silence on the other end. So long I thought maybe the call dropped. Then she said she needed more time, that Kay was still upset and she didn't want to push her right now. I hung up without saying goodbye. I was done having the same conversation over and over. She wasn't ready to hold Kay accountable. She was still making excuses and waiting for this to blow over. But it wasn't going to blow over. Jay would never forget what they did to him. I would never forget watching my son's heart break at that police station. My wife was choosing her daughter over doing what was right, and that told me everything I needed to know. I put my phone down and went back to work. There was nothing else to say until she was ready to actually fix what Kay broke. That evening, Jay came home with a huge smile on his face. He dropped his backpack and pulled out a piece of paper from the front pocket. He handed it to me, and I saw it was a printed itinerary. The father had planned out the whole weekend trip. They were driving up to his son's favorite hiking spot on Saturday morning. There was a campsite nearby where they'd stay Saturday night. Sunday, they were going to have a campfire, and each boy would share stories and memories about their friend. Jay pointed to a note at the bottom. The father had written that they should bring pictures if they had any, that he wanted to see his son through their eyes and remember all the good times. I read through the whole thing twice. Every detail was thought out. Every moment was planned to honor his son's memory. Jay sat down next to me on the couch. He said he was nervous about the trip, that it was going to be really emotional and hard, but he was also grateful to be included, to be part of keeping his friend's memory alive. He looked at me and said the father treating him like family meant everything, especially after his own family betrayed him like they did. I put my arm around his shoulders. I told him he had every right to feel hurt by what Kay and his mom did, that their actions were wrong and nothing would change that. But I also told him to focus on the good people in his life, the father who stepped up, his friends who had his back, the people who showed him what real family looks like. Jay nodded and leaned against me. He said he was lucky to have his friend's dad in his life, that losing his friend was the worst thing that ever happened, but having the father around helped. I agreed, and we sat there quietly for a while. Tomorrow he'd go to the school, and then this weekend he'd go on the trip. And Kay and my wife would have to live with what they did. 2 days before the trip, my phone rang around lunchtime. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer it. A woman's voice on the other end introduced herself as Rhonda. It took me a second to place the name, and then I remembered she was my wife's sister, the one they were staying with. She apologized right away for bothering me, but said she needed to tell me something about what was happening at her house with Kay and my wife. I stepped outside to take the call away from my coworkers. Rhonda sounded uncomfortable, like she didn't want to be making this call but felt like she had to. She told me Kay had been receiving packages daily at her house. Not just 1 or 2, but multiple deliveries every single day. Still shopping online despite everything that had happened. When Rhonda confronted her about it, Kay claimed she had money in her account from before. Money she'd saved up that she was just now spending. But Rhonda didn't believe her. She said Kay couldn't even look her in the eye when she said it. I felt my jaw tighten as I listened. Of course Kay was still spending money. She couldn't help herself. Rhonda kept talking. She said her daughter Gracie saw Kay's credit card get declined at a store yesterday. Kay had a full meltdown in the parking lot, started crying and yelling about how nothing was working and everything was against her. Gracie felt so awkward she just waited in the car until Kay calmed down enough to drive home. Rhonda said she was worried that Kay was digging herself into a financial hole and my wife was just ignoring it. Every time Rhonda tried to bring it up, my wife would change the subject or make excuses. I thanked Rhonda for telling me and asked if she'd talk to my wife about her concerns. Rhonda sighed into the phone. She said my wife got defensive whenever she brought up Kay's behavior. Insisted her daughter just needed support, not judgment. That Kay was going through a hard time, and everyone needed to back off. Rhonda said she loved her sister, but watching her enable Kay was frustrating. She'd seen this pattern before with Kay, and it never ended well. I told Rhonda I appreciated her reaching out, that it meant a lot she was willing to be honest with me, even though it put her in an awkward position with my wife. She said she just wanted someone to know what was really going on. After we hung up, I stood outside for a few more minutes. The confirmation that Kay was still spending recklessly didn't surprise me, but it did make me angry. She stole from Jay, faced 0 consequences, and now she was probably racking up debt she'd never be able to pay back. And my wife was letting it happen. The night before the trip, Jay came into the living room carrying his backpack. He'd been in his room for over an hour packing his bag carefully. Everything was organized and folded. He pulled out a piece of paper from his front pocket and handed it to me. He said he'd written a letter to bring with him to read at the memorial. He wanted to know if I'd read it first to make sure it was okay. I unfolded the paper and started reading. The first line talked about how his friend always made everyone laugh even when things were hard. How he had this way of making people feel was included and important. Jay wrote about specific memories they shared, playing video games until 3 in the morning during summer break. The time his friend convinced him to try out for the school play, even though Jay was terrified. How his friend was there for him when things got tough at home. The letter went on to talk about how much Jay missed him, how he thought about him every single day, how he wished he could tell him one more time that he was the best friend anyone could ask for. By the time I got to the end, my eyes were burning and I had to blink hard to clear them. I could barely get through it without my throat closing up. The maturity and thoughtfulness in every word hit me hard. This was my son, the kid who worked at a pizza shop and saved every dollar to honor his friend's memory. Jay sat down next to me on the couch. He said he'd been thinking a lot about family lately and what it really means. He looked at me with this serious expression I wasn't used to seeing on his face. He said the father of his friend had shown him more care in one phone call than Kay, or my wife showed him when it mattered most. That hurt to hear, but I couldn't argue with it. He was right. The father stepped up when Jay's own family let him down. Jay said he was starting to understand that family wasn't just about who you were related to. It was about who showed up for you when things got hard, who had your back when everyone else walked away. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him I was proud of him. Not just for how he handled everything with Kay and his mom, but for the person he was becoming. Early Saturday morning, I heard a van pull up outside. Jay was already awake and waiting by the door with his backpack. I walked out with him to meet the father. He stepped out of the van and shook my hand firmly. His grip was strong and his eyes were kind. He told me I raised a good kid, and his son loved Jay like a brother. said it meant everything to him that Jay wanted to honor his son's memory like this. I thanked him for including Jay in the trip and for everything he was doing. He just nodded and said the boys were his son's family, and that made them his family too. Jay climbed into the van where the other boys were already waiting. They were all excited and talking over each other. The father got back in the driver's seat, and I watched them pull away down the street. While Jay was gone on the trip, I spent the weekend cleaning the house, vacuuming, doing laundry, washing dishes, keeping my hands busy so my mind wouldn't spiral. The silence felt heavy without Jay there. Every room reminded me of what had happened. Kay's empty bedroom, the spot where Jay's money had been hidden, the living room where my wife and I had our last argument before she left. I kept thinking about everything that led to this point. How my wife chose to protect Kay instead of doing what was right. How she lied to the police to cover for her daughter. How she was still making excuses for Kay's behavior even as it got worse. I wasn't ready to reach out to my wife when she still wouldn't hold Kay accountable. Nothing had changed. Kay hadn't returned anything or paid Jay back. My wife hadn't admitted she was wrong. Sunday afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when I heard a car pull up. I looked out the window and saw my wife getting out of her sister's car. She looked exhausted. Dark circles under her eyes and her clothes wrinkled like she'd been wearing them for days. She knocked on the door even though she still had her key. I opened it and we stood there looking at each other. She said she couldn't keep doing this, that the separation was tearing her apart, and she missed me. I stepped aside to let her in. She walked to the couch and sat down heavily. I stayed standing. I asked her directly if Kay had returned the items or paid Jay back. She looked down at her hands and admitted Kay hadn't done either. When I asked why she was here then, she got frustrated. Said I was being unreasonable and holding a grudge. That I was punishing her for trying to protect her daughter. I felt my anger rise again but kept my voice calm. I told her this wasn't about a grudge. It was about Kay stealing from Jay and her lying to the police to cover it up. I told her until there was real accountability for what Kay did, I couldn't pretend everything was fine between us. She stared at me for a long moment, and I could see the frustration building in her face. She said Kay was struggling, and making her return everything or pay it back would embarrass her in front of everyone. I felt my jaw tighten as I pointed out that Jay was embarrassed at the police station when she lied to the officer and made him look like he was making up the whole theft. Her face went red, and she stood up from the couch. She said I cared more about being right than about our marriage, and that I was willing to throw everything away over this. I stood up too, and told her I cared about teaching both our kids that actions have consequences, that stealing from family and lying to police aren't things you just sweep under the rug. She grabbed her purse off the coffee table and headed for the door. I told her she knew where to find me when she was ready to do the right thing. She slammed the door so hard the picture frames on the wall rattled. That evening I was sitting on the couch when I heard a car pull up outside. I looked out the window and saw the father's van in the driveway. Jay climbed out of the passenger side with his backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked tired, but there was something different about his face, something calmer than I'd seen in weeks. I opened the door before he could knock, and he walked past me into the living room. He dropped his backpack by the couch and sat down heavily. I asked him how it went, and he was quiet for a minute before he started talking. He told me they hiked up to this spot on a ridge where his friend used to go to watch the sunsets. Said it took them almost 2 hours to get up there, but it was worth it. They sat up there as the sun went down, and they all took turns sharing their favorite memories around the campfire they built. Jay's voice got softer as he talked about it, and I could see his eyes getting wet. He said the father broke down crying when they read their letters out loud, but it wasn't a sad kind of crying. It was the kind of crying that happens when you finally let something out that's been stuck inside for too long. The boys all held each other and cried together, and the father told them his son would have loved knowing his friends cared this much. They decided right there to make it an annual trip, to come back every year on his birthday and keep his memory alive. Jay leaned back against the couch and rubbed his eyes. He mentioned that the father had asked about what was going on with our family. Jay told him everything about Kay stealing the money and my wife lying to the police. The father listened to the whole story and then told Jay something that stuck with him. He said sometimes the people who should protect you let you down, but that doesn't say anything about your worth as a person. It only shows who they really are. Jay looked at me and said that really hit him hard, hearing it from someone who lost his own son and still had room in his heart to care about other kids. Over the next few days, I watched Jay move around the house differently. He stood up straighter and didn't have that defeated look in his eyes anymore. On Tuesday night while we were eating dinner, he told me the trip helped him understand something important. He said he used to think family meant the people you were related to by blood, but now he realized family is really about who shows up for you when things get hard. The father showed up for him when his own stepmom and stepsister didn't. His friends pooled their money and made sure he could go on the trip, even after Kay stole from him. Those were his real family now. Wednesday morning I was at work when my phone rang. The number wasn't one I recognized, so I almost didn't answer. I picked up and a woman's voice asked if I was the father of Kay. I said I was her stepfather and asked who was calling. She said she was calling from a debt collection agency, and they were trying to reach Kay about an unpaid credit card bill. She asked if I knew how to contact her because she wasn't responding to their calls or letters. I told her I was separated from Kay's mother and didn't have current contact information for either of them. The woman thanked me and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone and realized Kay's spending problem was way bigger than just the $400 she stole from Jay. That same afternoon, my phone rang again. Different number, but another debt collector. This one was looking for Kay about a returned check to a clothing store. I gave them the same answer about not having contact information. By the time I got home from work that evening, I'd gotten 3 more calls. All of them looking for Kay. All of them asking about unpaid debts. Friday morning, 2 more collectors called before I even finished my coffee. By the end of the week, I'd received 5 calls total from different companies trying to track Kay down about money she owed them. I didn't reach out to my wife about the calls because it wasn't my responsibility to shield Kay from her choices anymore. If she racked up debt, she needed to face those consequences herself. I put my phone on silent and focused on making sure Jay had what he needed. Every time a collector called, I let it go to voicemail. I deleted the messages without listening to them. Whatever mess Kay created was hers to clean up, not mine. 4 days after the last collector call, my phone rang with a number I actually recognized. It was Rhonda, my wife's sister. I almost didn't answer because I figured she was calling to lecture me about being too hard on Kay or to tell me my wife was miserable. But something made me pick up. Rhonda's voice sounded strained when she said hello. She asked if I had a minute to talk, and I told her I did. She took a deep breath and said things at her house had gotten tense. Kay received a court summons for an unpaid credit card, and it arrived at Rhonda's address because that's where Kay had been getting her mail forwarded. Rhonda said she wasn't trying to get involved in our family drama, but she thought I should know what was happening. My wife finally saw the extent of Kay's spending and debt when that summons arrived. Rhonda told me Kay tried to hide it at first, stuffing the envelope in her purse, but Rhonda's daughter Gracie saw it and told her mom. When Rhonda confronted Kay about it, Kay broke down and admitted she owed money to multiple credit card companies. Rhonda said my wife looked like someone had punched her in the stomach when she heard the full story. I thanked Rhonda for telling me and asked how much debt Kay had racked up. Rhonda went quiet for a second before she said she didn't know the exact amount, but it was in the thousands. Then she dropped the real bomb. She told me my wife was panicking because she co-signed for one of Kay's credit cards years ago, thinking it would help Kay build credit. Now she was on the hook for thousands of dollars Kay charged and never paid. The credit card company was coming after both of them, and my wife didn't have that kind of money sitting around. Rhonda said my wife spent the whole previous night crying and looking at her bank statements, trying to figure out how to handle it. I sat there holding the phone and feeling a weird mix of emotions. Part of me felt vindicated that the truth was coming out and people were finally seeing what I'd been dealing with. But another part of me felt concerned for my wife, who was realizing the consequences of enabling Kay's behavior for so long. She protected Kay from every small consequence over the years, and now she was facing a massive one herself. I told Rhonda I appreciated her calling and asked her to keep me updated if anything else happened. She said she would, and then added that she hoped we could all figure this out somehow. After I hung up, I sat on the couch and stared at the wall for a while. Jay came home from work an hour later, and I could tell something was different about him. He walked straighter, and his face looked calmer than it had in weeks. He dropped his backpack by the door and told me he got his paycheck. I asked him what he planned to do with it, and he said he wanted to open a new bank account at a different bank. I drove him to the credit union across town that same evening. We sat with a woman at a desk who helped him fill out the paperwork for a savings account. Jay put his entire check into the account and asked about getting a debit card. The woman explained it would arrive in the mail within a week. On the drive home, Jay told me he learned his lesson about keeping cash in his room. He said he never imagined his own family would steal from him, but now he knew better. He said the father had been texting him regularly, checking in on how he was doing and sending him photos from the trip. There were pictures of the sunset from the ridge and shots of the campfire they built. Jay showed me one photo of all the boys standing together with their arms around each other. He said it felt good to have an adult in his life who treated him with respect and actually cared about his feelings. The father sent him a message every few days asking about work or school, or just saying he was thinking about him. Jay said it meant more to him than the father probably realized. 3 weeks after the initial theft, I was making dinner when my phone rang. It was my wife and I almost didn't answer, but I picked up on the 4th ring and heard her sobbing on the other end. She could barely get words out between the crying. She finally managed to say that Rhonda asked her and Kay to leave. The debt collectors wouldn't stop calling the house, and it was affecting Rhonda's family. Gracie was getting stressed because the phone rang constantly, and Rhonda's husband was tired of dealing with it. Rhonda told my wife she loved her, but they needed to find somewhere else to stay. My wife said she didn't know what to do. She couldn't afford a place on her own, and Kay's debt was overwhelming. I heard the desperation in her voice, but I stayed firm about my boundaries. I told her I was sorry she was going through this, but she made her choices when she protected Kay instead of holding her accountable. She started crying harder and said she didn't know it would get this bad. I told her I was willing to talk about her coming home, but only if Kay took real steps toward accountability. Kay needed to return to therapy, get a job, and set up payment plans for her debts and for paying Jay back. My wife went quiet for a long time. I could hear her breathing on the other end, but she wasn't saying anything. Finally, she said she would talk to Kay about it. Her voice sounded small and defeated. I could tell she was finally starting to understand that protecting Kay from consequences hadn't helped anyone, especially not Kay herself. 2 days later, my phone rang with Kay's number on the screen. I stared at it for 3 rings before I picked up. Her voice came through small and shaky, nothing like the defiant tone she'd used when I confronted her about the theft. She apologized for taking Jay's money and for everything that happened after. The words tumbled out fast like she'd been practicing them. I sat down at the kitchen table and listened to her cry on the other end. When she finished, I told her I appreciated the apology, but words weren't enough. She needed to show through her actions that she was taking responsibility. That meant getting a job and making a payment plan to pay Jay back every dollar. Kay went quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing. Then she said she understood, and that she'd already applied to several places. She had an interview at a retail store next week. She sounded genuine, but I'd heard promises from her before that never turned into anything. I told her I hoped she meant it this time, and we ended the call. Jay came home from work an hour later, and I told him about Kay's call. He just nodded and went to his room without saying much. That weekend, my wife called and asked if she could come over to talk in person. I agreed, and she showed up Saturday afternoon looking smaller somehow. The stress of the past few weeks had worn her down, and it showed in the way she carried herself. We sat in the living room and she started talking before I could say anything. She told me she'd been doing a lot of thinking about how she'd handled things with Kay over the years. She admitted she'd made excuses for Kay's behavior because she felt guilty about the divorce from Kay's father. She wanted to be the supportive parent and thought protecting Kay was the same as loving her. I listened as she explained that she saw now how her protection became enabling. She said it hurt Kay in the long run by not teaching her accountability. Watching Kay spiral with debt and seeing how it affected everyone was a wake-up call she couldn't ignore anymore. My wife looked at me with red eyes and asked if I'd be willing to try marriage counseling with her. She also asked if Kay could come home under strict conditions. Kay would need to have a job, pay rent, and follow house rules, including paying Jay back. I told her I needed to think about it and talk to Jay first. His feelings and safety in his own home mattered most, and I wasn't going to make decisions about our household without his input. She nodded and said she understood. She said Jay deserved to have a say in this after what he'd been through. We talked for another hour about what the conditions would look like and how we'd enforce them. She left around dinner time, and I spent the rest of the evening thinking about what to say to Jay. I found Jay in his room doing homework that night. I sat on the edge of his bed and told him about the conversation with his mom. I explained that Kay had called to apologize and that his mom wanted to try working things out with counseling and strict rules. Jay stopped writing and looked at me. He said he was hesitant but not completely opposed to them coming back. He said he'd need to see real change from Kay, not just promises. He also said he wanted his own lock on his bedroom door. I told him that was completely reasonable, and we could install one before they came back if we decided to let that happen. Jay went back to his homework, and I thought the conversation was over. Then he looked up again and told me he'd been talking to the father about family stuff. The father told him that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or letting people hurt you again. It means protecting yourself while leaving room for people to grow. Jay said that made sense to him, and he wanted to try protecting himself better going forward. I put my hand on his shoulder and told him I was proud of how mature he was handling everything. He gave me a small smile and said the father had been helping him think through a lot of things. I looked at Jay and felt something shift inside me watching how he handled all this. Most kids his age would be angry or bitter, but here he was thinking about what made sense for everyone. I told him I was proud of how mature he was being about everything and that we'd take things slow. If Kay and his mom came back, it would be with clear boundaries and real consequences if those boundaries got broken. No more second chances without accountability. Jay nodded and said that sounded fair, then went back to his homework. I left his room feeling like maybe we could get through this after all, but only if everyone did their part. A week later, my phone buzzed with a text from Kay. She attached a photo of her first paycheck stub from the retail store. At the bottom, she'd written that $50 was going straight to Jay as her first payment. I stared at the screen for a minute, not sure how to feel about it. It was such a small amount compared to the $400 she owed, but it was something real and solid. I showed Jay when he got home from the school, and he looked at it without much expression. He just said okay, and went to make a sandwich. I could tell he was waiting to see if this was actually going to continue, or if Kay would quit after one paycheck like she'd done with other jobs before. My wife called me that same evening and asked if I'd be willing to try marriage counseling with her. She said she found a therapist who worked with blended families and had an opening next week. I agreed because I knew we needed help figuring out how to communicate better. We'd been talking past each other for so long that we needed someone to help us actually hear what the other person was saying. The first session happened on a Tuesday evening in a small office that smelled like lavender. The therapist was a woman in her 50s who asked us both to explain what brought us there. My wife went first and talked about feeling caught between her daughter and me. I went second and explained how the theft and the lying to police had broken my trust. The therapist listened to both of us and then pointed out that we'd both been making decisions without really talking to each other first. My wife had been protecting Kay from consequences, and I'd been issuing ultimatums without trying to work through solutions together. She said we both had work to do if we wanted to fix this. The therapist gave us homework for the next week. We had to practice active listening and try to understand where the other person was coming from instead of just defending our own position. It felt awkward at first, but I could see how we'd both been so focused on being right that we stopped actually listening. My wife admitted she'd been enabling Kay because she felt guilty about her divorce from Kay's dad and wanted to make up for it. I admitted I'd been so angry about what happened to Jay that I couldn't see past my need for immediate justice. We left that first session feeling raw, but also like maybe there was a path forward if we both stayed committed to the work. Kay sent Jay another payment 2 weeks later. Another $50 with a note saying she was keeping her promise. Jay put the money in his bank account and thanked her through a text message. He didn't say much to me about it, but I could see him starting to believe that maybe Kay was actually trying this time. My wife told me Kay had also started seeing her own therapist to work on her spending problems and impulse control. The therapist was helping Kay understand why she felt the need to buy things whenever she had money and how to break that pattern. My wife seemed hopeful that Kay was finally taking her issues seriously instead of just making excuses. After a month of counseling sessions and seeing Kay make consistent payments, I told my wife I was willing to let them move back home. But there had to be conditions that everyone agreed to follow. Kay needed to sign a written agreement about the house rules, paying rent once she'd finished paying Jay back and sticking to her payment plan. My wife agreed and said Kay was ready to follow whatever rules I set. We spent an evening drafting the agreement together, and Kay signed it without arguing. She said she understood why it was necessary and that she wanted to prove she could be trusted again. I had a locksmith come install a new lock on Jay's bedroom door before they moved back in. Jay wanted that extra security, and I wasn't going to argue with him about it. The first week they were back felt strange and uncomfortable. Kay stayed in her room most of the time when she wasn't at work. She'd come out for dinner and be polite, but then disappear again right after. My wife tried too hard to make everything feel normal, talking extra bright and cheerful about random things. But nothing felt normal yet, and pretending it did just made the tension worse. Jay and I would exchange looks across the dinner table when my wife would go on about some TV show or recipe she wanted to try. We all knew we were just going through the motions until things actually felt better, instead of just looking better on the surface. Jay kept his distance from Kay, but he was polite when they ran into each other in the kitchen or hallway. I watched him carefully during those interactions and could see he was testing whether the changes were real or just temporary. He'd ask Kay how work was going and she'd answer, then they'd both find reasons to be somewhere else. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't comfortable either. I could tell Jay was protecting himself by not letting Kay get close again until she proved over time that she'd really changed. He told me one night that the father had taught him it was okay to be cautious with people who'd hurt you before. You could give them a chance without giving them all of you right away. 2 months after the initial theft, Kay made her final payment to Jay. She handed him the last $100 in cash and told him she was sorry it took so long. Jay counted it carefully, all $400 laid out on the kitchen table. Then he put it directly into his bank account using his phone without saying much. Kay looked like she wanted him to say something more, maybe tell her they were okay now, but Jay just nodded and went to his room. My wife looked disappointed that there wasn't some big emotional moment of forgiveness and reconciliation. I had to remind her later that Jay paying him back was just the first step. It didn't erase what happened or automatically fix their relationship. Later that night, Jay came and sat on the couch next to me while I was watching TV. He said he appreciated Kay paying him back and keeping her promise about that, but it didn't erase what happened or make them close again. He said maybe someday they could rebuild some trust, but it would take a long time and a lot more than just money. He needed to see that Kay had really changed as a person, not just paid back a debt to get back in the house. I told him that was completely fair and that he got to decide what his relationship with Kay looked like going forward. Nobody could force him to trust her again or be close with her if he didn't feel ready for that. He seemed relieved to hear me say that out loud. The father started calling Jay once a week to set up dinner plans. Jay would come home from those dinners looking lighter somehow, like someone had lifted weight off his shoulders. He told me they talked about his friend and shared memories, but they also talked about normal stuff like how school was going and what was happening at the pizza shop. The father treated Jay like he mattered, like his thoughts and feelings were important, and I could see my son starting to believe in adults again after everything that happened with Kay and my wife. These monthly dinners became something Jay looked forward to, and I was grateful this man chose to stay in my son's life when he could have just moved on with his grief. My wife and I kept going to counseling every week. The therapist made us practice talking to each other about Kay and Jay without getting defensive or shutting down. We had to learn how to actually listen instead of just waiting for our turn to argue. Slowly, we started figuring out how to be on the same team again instead of working against each other. The therapist helped us see that we needed to agree on rules and consequences before talking to the kids, not after when it was too late. My wife admitted she had trouble saying no to Kay because she felt guilty about the divorce, and I admitted I had trouble compromising once I decided something was wrong. We were both learning that being a united front meant sometimes neither of us got exactly what we wanted, but the kids got consistency and fairness. 3 months into her job, Kay got promoted to shift supervisor. She came home and actually told us about it instead of hiding in her room. She seemed proud of herself in a way I had never seen before. She talked about training new employees and making schedules, and I could tell she liked having people depend on her at work. For the first time, I saw her taking real responsibility for something instead of making excuses or blaming other people when things went wrong. My wife cried happy tears that night after Kay went to bed, and I had to admit it felt good to see Kay growing up finally. 6 months after Kay stole that money and our family fell apart, we were eating dinner together most nights again. Jay still had his lock on his door and kept his distance from Kay, but they could be in the same room without tension filling up all the space. Kay was working full-time and going to therapy twice a month to deal with her spending problems. My wife and I were still in counseling, but we were sleeping in the same bed again and actually talking about our days. We were not some perfect, happy family, but we were functioning like a family should. Jay had his boundaries and his monthly dinners with the father, Kay had her job and her therapy, and my wife and I were rebuilding trust one small decision at a time. The father stayed important in Jay's life, reminding all of us that family is not just about blood. Real love means holding people accountable when they mess up while still leaving room for them to grow and become better. Sometimes the family you choose matters just as much as the family you are born into, and sometimes doing the right thing means watching people face consequences, even when it hurts everyone involved.